last week we had last week we had an interesting discussion in the Machlokes between Rabba and Rava on whether or not an object that falls into, say, the Rishus Harabim and will most certainly be trampled on. So if it had a siman, the siman will probably be trampled and not recognizable. So there's a machlokes between Rabba and Rava, two Amayroim. How do we approach this? So the Gemara went through all kinds of different permutations and discussions of what each one holds, and ultimately wanted to slug up one and the other. So we came to the point where, for our purposes today, we'll just sum up that Rabba is the more makel, and Rabba says that the greater likelihood is that there won't be a siman left. So according to him, the only way you can identify is through a siman, and if there's no siman, you can't identify. So it all surrounds the question of whether or not there is a siman, there's something unusual or something different about this item which would allow it to be called out. So if someone would be able to say, this is the siman, and basically when the circumstance is such that the siman is likely to have disappeared, he is makel and he says you don't have to call it out. Rava, on the other hand, because he was more strict in this point, and we tried to slug him up. So he says, you know what? You don't need the person who lost the item doesn't need to identify the siman. It's enough for him to identify the place. So, in other words, if a person announces, I found an item at the corner of Lamberton and Arcola, and then someone says, oh, wait a minute, that's me, and then he identifies what it is, that's sufficient identification for him to be able to receive it. Rabbi says, no, place is never an identifier. The problem you have with place is that in a Rishus Harabim, if someone steps something, if many people step on it, they could kick it around, and before you know it, it's no longer at Arcola and Lamberton. It could be kicked down the street to Kenbrook. I mean, before you know it, it's somewhere else. So that makes it difficult. But underlying this, that's the machlokes, is how you approach this. And Rabba is more makel, and Rava is not, and therefore they each have their different views. So essentially, summing it up from all the differences. Why is that important now? Because we're going to start today, maybe about, I don't know, 20 lines maybe from the top, the last word, lema ketanoi, where the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, you're telling me this is a machlokes between Rabba and Rava, very good, but before Rabba and Rava, there were Tanoi who said the same thing. So, I mean, I'm not going to use the word harshly, but it's a form of plagiarism. Rabba and Rava are being mechadish a machlokes that was already a machlokes between two Tanoim many years before. So that's what the Gemara is trying to understand, because whenever two Amoraim argue or have a discussion, we always look back to its origins. And if there is an origin, okay, it's good to say Rabba and Rava have a different view, but each one holds like a Tana, because we want to give attribution. So the Gemara is asking, why did you give attribution? That's really what the subject of the kasha is. And now the Gemara is going to go through that machlokes tanoim and why it isn't or isn't similar to the machlokes amoraim. We're going to see the inside of the Gemara, how the Gemara teaches us how to go through that and how to understand that discussion. So we start from the words lema, chof gimel amid aleph. The Gemara, lema ketanoi. Let's say the machlokes that we have between Rabba and Rava is like the machlokes of Tanoim, as Rashi says, plukta de Rabba v'Rabba. The machlokes between Rabba and Rava is Tanoim. What is the machlokes? And it's in our Mishnah. What is the machlokes? Rabbi Yehuda Omar. So let's go back, quick look at Chof Aleph Amud Aleph. Look at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, we've been discussing some different things. If you find, for instance, bread, and we find it whether it's the baker's bread or homemade bread, or whether it's another, or whether it's all different kinds of items, then Rav Meir, who's the Tanakama, he is Makel. He's more Makel. He says Hare Elu Shalom. It's all his. In other words, you don't have to call it out. And then in the middle of that Mishnah, take a look. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, says Rabbi Yehuda, Kol sheyesh bo shinui chayiv lahachriz. If it's out of the norm. Now, what is the norm? So we can all pretty much accept, if you find a pear has no distinguishable qualities, right? An apple, we're talking about generally many items that are off the shelf. You can't distinguish those. So in other words, Rabbi Yehuda says those are definitely things that belong to the person. But kol sheyesh bo shinui, anything that has a shinui, it's different than the norm. And he gives an example. Motza ogulu b'socho chayres. You find what they used to do is they used to take these dates and pound them into like little cakes. Okay, fine. So you have a date cake, or whatever. But wait a minute, b'socho cheres. In the middle of the date cake, you find a piece of glass, so you find some item. That's a shinui. That's what he describes as a shinui. Or kikor b'socho mos. You find a loaf of bread in the middle. You find a coin. That's not normal. That's not the norm. So those are shinuyim, and Rabbi Yehuda says that shinuyim you have to announce. You have to return them. You can't just say, "Okay, it's mine. I'm walking away." So now that's the Mishnah. So let's look at the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Kol sheyesh bo kol davar sheyesh bo shinui chayav lahachris. Anything that has a shinu, you have to return. And what was that example? Ketzad, Motza Igul B'Soka Cheres, Kikar B'Soka Mos, which we just saw in the Mishnah. So those you have to return. Now, the general rule in Gemara is two of the Tanoim who had the highest profile of disagreement, let's say, or discussion, was Reb Meir of Yehuda. Reb Meir is known as the Tanakama and Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda, of course, was the Nasi, and he was the one who arranged the Mishnah. So he's most pronounced. So oftentimes the Mishnah will be silent on the portion of the Mishnah prior to Rabbi Yehuda, and when Rabbi Yehuda comes in, then he says Rabbi Yehuda Oimer. Rabbi Yehuda, he's the Rosh Bahag, he's the he's the Gadol Ador, and he says what he has to say. What we extrapolate is that everything that Rabbi Yehuda didn't say was the Tanakama. That's in all of Shas. So you can count on it that when Rabbi Yehuda says an opinion, everything prior to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is what we call the Tanakama. And the Tanakama most times is Reb Meir, because they clashed in Torah. So Reb Meir, of course, L'Shem Shemayim. So Reb Meir was the Tanakama, and Reb Yehuda was the sort of the counterbalance. So the Gemara automatically says, since the Gemara was silent, since the Mishnah was silent, and said that Reb Yehuda said these things, Michlal. So what do you extrapolate? The Tanakama Savar, that the Tanakama holds Hari Elu Shalom. What is Shalom? If you have a Shinui, these two examples, money in a bread or a piece of glass or something found in a cake made out of dates, those are Shalom. That's what you have to extrapolate, because Rabbi Yehuda said it. Michlal, we infer that Reb Meir argues. So now you have a machlokes between Reb Meir and Yehuda. If you find something with a shinui, something out of the ordinary, do you have to announce it? Tanakama says no. Reb Yehuda says yes. Doesn't that sound like Rabba and Rava? I mean, you have a case where you find something in Rosh Hashanah and people stepped on it and it had a siman, and now the siman is not recognizable or whatever. You have Rabbah who takes Rab Meir's position. Wait a minute. This is too out there for us to say that someone has to announce it. That's probably the owner was probably Miyayish, because if he left something like that in the Rishus Harabim, no chance he'll get it back. So even if the simon is intact, not if it's squashed or destroyed, even if the simon is intact, he will have given up because of the circumstance of that item being in the Rishus Harabim. That's the point. And that's what Meir and Rabbah are saying. Rava, on the other hand, and also Rabbi Yehuda are saying, no. If you have a specific siman, and in this case a shinui, something that's unusual, then if you announce it, who is going to know that there was a quarter baked into a bread? I'm not going to know. You're not going to know. The owner will know. So if you announce that, you know what? In other words, I found this and this, and the person comes and says, yes, of course, that was my bread, and there was a quarter in it, or a quarter and a dime, then that should be a good simon. So we see that the machlokes between Rabbah and Rava was already discussed a century before between Reb Meir and Yehuda in our Mishnah. So that's the kasha. How do you go about saying, it's a new chiddush, Rabbah and Rava having a machlokes, without giving attribution to Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda? That's the kasha of the Gemara. Okay, so now the Gemara wants to go deeper into this, and we're going to do this now. But first, the Gemara wants to set some ground rules. What are the ground rules upon which we're acting? Says the Gemara, Savruha, both Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda agree. The Kula Alma Siman Habo Me'elov have a Siman. All right, now we have to understand what this means. Siman Habo Me'elov have a Siman. Look at Rashi. What it translates in is siman that comes about by itself, not something that someone did, but a siman that came about through means not directed by the people. Says Rashi, Horoi lovo me'elov, it comes by itself. Kugon cheres, you take a cheres, a piece of glass, omim shenafel be'igel. What happens if a person is kneading these dates? In other words, he has to take these dates and make them into a sort of a round cake. And he's doing it in his kitchen, at his kitchen table, and he's kneading, and he doesn't realize that a shard of glass fell into this compound, to this thing he's doing. He didn't put it there. It fell in. Unbeknownst to him, it fell in. Now, will he be able to respond if someone says, I found a shard of glass in this, found a shard of glass, can anybody come and, or whatever, give me some details about it? This guy's not going to respond. He doesn't even know it's in there. It happens.
Also, people have gone to jail for putting shards of glass in bread.
Because they did it intentionally.
Right.
Right. But
on the more, if he did it unintentionally, but then realized that he's working on all this, and all of a sudden sees, oh my goodness, if he's glass, he's going to pull that out. So unless he's a real criminal, he's not going to. Not only is he, it's not just that if it happens by accident, doesn't realize that he can't identify it, but more so if he had known about it, he wouldn't have let this thing go out of his house.
Right, no, but here we're talking about like Abby Simon. If he doesn't know it's in there and someone announces, I found this very nice fig cake, and if someone can give me a simon, I'll give it back to him. Is he going to be able to come back and give a simon and say, you know what, there was a shard of glass in that, and if you check it, you'll see it, therefore it's mine. He won't know to say it because it happened by accident. That's what the Gemara is talking about. Not that he would, of course, he wouldn't want anybody to bite into his cake there with a shard of glass. Of course not. But the kasha is, will he even know it's a simon? So the Gemara here says, Savruha, both Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda agree, the Kula Alman, Siman Habo Me'elov have a simon. A simon that falls into an item is a simon. If someone were to say, you know what, and describe the circumstance with unbeknownst to him that a glass fell in. You're going to ask, how is he going to be able to say it's a siman? All right. But they come to that conclusion that a siman habo me'elav, a siman that happens without a person's intent, is still a siman. So let's look at Rashi further.
Why is the Gemara going to such extremes to paint this picture? Why not just a siman fell in unbeknownst to him, but it's something he owns, something he can prove. And so when someone announces there was a, I don't know, a South African Krugerrand in that loaf of bread, he says, yeah, that's mine. I can prove it. In other
Oh, wait
words,
a minute, Chaim. How's he going to prove it if he didn't know it fell in?
because when someone announces it, they're going to say, guess what? I found a loaf of bread with X object. He will then look at he'll say, oh, that's mine. And now I can prove it. He'll be able to prove it.
No, but okay. But you're taking a leap here by saying that if I lost something and I know what I lost, and then someone else may have actually lost the same thing as me with a quarter in it, and I didn't lose it.
I see what you're saying, right? It's too common. It's not a unique object we're talking.
That's
Right.
That's it. That's the point. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so none of this is a new guy. I mean, there's a good example because you lose a dollar bill. In theory, that it's could be very clearly identified. Something was written or whatever. A coin is generic, but more than that, if you lost a Krugerrand, you'd be like, oh my! I was counting my coins and then I was baking my cake. And afterwards, I thought I had 15 coins and I only had 14. So if there's one in there, that must be mine. Okay, that's a pretty good simile. But quarters we have all the time and we don't keep track of exactly because we get them to change every day and we use them in meters, we use them this, we use them in that. And therefore, those would be, even though it's got value, unlike the piece of glass, it's still totally generic.
Right. So you're making a good point that what was in the object is not unique in and of itself. It's not a Krugerrand or a 1943 penny. It's if he had a 1943 penny, which is, let's say, 5 in the world, and you found that 1943 penny in there, and someone announces, of course it's mine. I had one of those pennies, and everybody knows I had it. But if you find a quarter, and he has no havamina that his quarter fell into the bread, why would he say it's mine? Oh, someone else has a bread that was lost and had a quarter in it. Mine didn't have a quarter in it. So look at the next Rashi. Have a siman, says Rashi, the omrinan, because we say l'shem siman nosnu sham. In other words, we're going to extrapolate that, no, it didn't fall in by accident. The public is going to say, no, it didn't fall in there. He did it because he wanted to identify this bread as his. The low nafel me'elav. It didn't fall from itself. The davar sheyesh ber siman. It really is a davar sheyesh ber siman. So in other words, the machloikis is so Brua, we're okay. Meir of Yehuda agree that siman habo me'elav have a siman, except that what we're talking about is not me'elav, we're talking about where he actually put it in. So that's what Rashi is saying. It says that everybody agrees that a siman that happened by itself is a siman, except that here, that's not what happened. What happened is here, he actually put it in so that he would have proof positive that it's his bread.
So
that's what he did.
So he would be able to claim it.
He what?
He would be able to claim it if it were
exactly, that he would be able to claim it. So the Gemara is saying that the machlokes, everybody agrees that siman habo me'elav have a siman, but here he did it intentionally, and then that will be the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Okay, one other thing that's important that they agree on, umarvirin al ha'ochlin. Remember last week we had a discussion of whether or not a person who sees food on the ground will walk by and leave it. So we kind of came to the conclusion that a Jew wouldn't do that. It's not fitting to leave food on the ground. One would pick it up and put it in the trash. And the Gemara went back and forth, but a nochri, a non-Jew or an animal, whatever. In other words, people leave trash on the ground. A Yid has more sensitivity to food because food is something from heaven, from the Rebbeinu Shalom, that he doesn't want to desecrate it. So rather than leaving it on the ground, you pick it up and put it in the trash. That was the general rule. However, here, Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda agree that mavir and ala ochlin, that people leave food on the ground. In other words, not everybody picks it up. So as a general rule, food will remain on the ground. Why is that important? Because if you take the, and Rashi just said, what did Rashi just say at the very end of Rashi? Take a look again, this is important. A person believes that people don't pick up fruit on the ground. So if there is a simon, if there is a coin in this bread, but no one picks the bread up, they just kick it around and walk on it and everything else, then it will be a simon which will be trampled on, and before you know it, they'll break that bread, the coin will fall out, and no one will associate the coin with the bread. So there'll no longer be a simon to that bread that had a coin in it. So in other words, the ground rules of the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda is that a coin in a bread is a simon, but people don't take care of the food, they allow the food to lie down. Now, it's a valid machlokes. So take a look. Right. So then now let's go to the Gemara. My love, the simon also lidros komiflagle. Is the machlokes between the Yehuda and Reb Meir not by simon also lidros? In other words, a simon which will be trampled on. Why? Because you have this bread that has this unusual simon, which everybody will know belongs to Jonathan. It's his bread. He's the one who baked it with a coin. But since people trample and walk all over it, it's not going to remain. So Mar Savar, Rab Meir says, Lo hava simon. Why? Because clearly you can't count on this bread remaining intact. And for someone to say, oh, it's my bread and I put the coin in it. There's no way he would know that. So when a person finds it, he will keep it because he doesn't have a havamina to announce, oh, this bread had a coin in it, because the coin is separated from the bread. So the owner of the bread will be miyayesh, because he will say to himself, you know what, I've got a bread with a coin in it, but this is a Mishus Rabban, hundreds, if not thousands of people are walking. No way I'm ever going to find this bread intact. Umar Sava have a simon. And Rabbi Yehuda says it is a simon. Therefore, a person is not going to be miyayish, because he's going to say, you know what, it's 50-50, 70-30. But there's a possibility that that simon will be there. Why should I be miyayish? So Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent, like Rava, and he will say, no, he's not going to give up on that simon. That simon will remain, and he will ultimately be able to get it back. So now we see that that's the machlokes. Rabba and Rava have the machlokes of Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda. So the kasha is intact. Why didn't they quote this machlokes? It's on all fours, as we say. It's literally the same machlokes. Again, because if the ground rules are that a simon in a bread is a good simon, everybody accepts it's a good simon, but that people will not pick up food, then those two items together create a situation where it's questionable whether that simon will still be intact with the bread. And then Reb Meir is Mekel, and Rabbi Yehuda is Machmir, just like Rabba is Mekel and Rabba is Machmir. So we have a completely exact machlokes Amaroim and Tanoim. So that's the kasha here. Okay, so it's a gewaltige Zach. I mean, why do we have this Amaroim argue? You see, Reb Meir and Yehuda in our Mishnah. Now, Rashi says Reb Yehuda Sava have a simon va'achal pi shezeh also lidros. You see, Reb Yehuda takes the stringent view. Even though it will be trampled on because people don't pick up food, nami have a simon. And a person is not going to give up and say, oh, it's all lost. No, he believes that simon will still be intact, even with everything else. Therefore, I'm not going to let someone just walk away with it. He has to announce. Now, if no one answers or no one responds, fine. Now, what happens if when the guy picks up the bread, the coin's not there? Then clearly he's not going to be able to say, I found a bread with a coin, because it will have separated. But you don't make it easy for him, Rabbi Yehuda says. Therefore, he is machmir. Okay? Okay, so that's okay. So let's So now that's the machlokes, everything fine. Comes Rav Zvid and asks a gewaldige kasha on Rav Meir. And he's going to show how could Rav Meir say what he's saying here. We see that he says the exact opposite. Omer Rav Zvid mishmei de Rava. Rav Zvid says in the name of Rava, if you have a havamina, if you believe that the Tanakama Rav Meir says simin also lidris loy have a simin umavirin ala ochrin, that it's not a simin and people don't pick up food, then look at the other situation that we had in the Mishnah. Remember, we said there's a difference between baker's bread and homemade bread. Baker's bread is uniform, therefore it's not a siman. So if someone is kikros shel nechtom, baker's bread, you don't have to announce because you can't tell one from the other. They're all off the shelf. But we said kikros shel balabayis, if it's you or your wife bakes beautiful challahs before Shabbos, those are unique. Those are yours because you made them. They're unique. They're not like off the shelf. So what did we say? Kikros shel balabayis, a loaf of bread from a balabayis, Rishus Harabim, which is in the Rishus Harabim. The Gemara says you have to call it out because it's unique. Right? The Gemara on my machriz. Why does he have to call it out? According to Reb Meir, there's no chance that that bread is going to remain intact because no one picks up the food, and because the siman will have been lost. So how could he say in our Mishnah that if you have a bread with a coin in it, and you don't have to return it because clearly that bread is already gone, but kikra shabalabayis, bread that's baked by a balabayis, which means that it's unique bread, you have to call it out. Why do you have to call it out? It's clearly not going to be recognizable because people leave food on the ground and it's trampled on. So l'chara, that's a stira in Rav Meir. Kikros shabalabayis, you have to call out. But kikros with a coin in it, which is also as unique as kikros shabalabayis, right? I mean, there's nothing. Both are unique items. Why in one does he say you don't have to call out, and why he has to call out another? So the Gemara is saying here, if that's what you want to make the machlokes between Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda, no way. The Rav Meir himself says that kikra shel balabayis you have to call out. How can he say here you don't have to call out? So that's a stira on Rav Meir. Amay makris, okay. So gevaldige kasha on Rav Meir. Now take a look at Rashi. The siman also lidrudus have a siman. The eagle hanatama the siman habo me'elov lav siman who Rav Yehuda Sava have a siman. So Rashi is explaining what we just said, that you want to say that according to him, since people will trample all over it, Rav Meir, therefore it's not going to be recognizable. Says Rashi, the siman also lidrudus have a siman. So it seems that according to Rav Meir, siman also lidrus have a siman. It is a siman. Yet in our Mishnah here in this machlokes with Rabbi Yehuda, he says it's not a siman. So it's an open and shut stira in Rav Meir. In one case he says yes, one case he says no. That doesn't work. He's got to be consistent.
What do you mean by stira? I'm sorry.
Stira means that in one circumstance, Rav Meir allows something to happen, and in a similar circumstance, in another case, he doesn't allow it to happen. What do we mean? In the case where you have a coin in a bread, which falls into the Rishus Harabim, and people step on it and kick it around, Rav Meir says, it's yours. Don't announce it because the likelihood of it remaining intact is almost nil. And therefore, that coin, which is in the bread, which would be a siman, which would be something to identify, doesn't exist. Yet, he says that when it comes to bread baked in your home, not with a coin in it, just bread baked in your home, meaning not off the shelf bread. Your wife bakes a nice bread, and it's her recipe. She made it, so it's unusual because it's not like everybody else's. There, he says, if that bread is found in the street, you have to call it out. Why should you call it out? It's just as likely to be trampled on, kicked around, and its unique bodies will be destroyed, just like bread with a coin in it will be destroyed. So the kasha on Reb Meir is, why is one unique situation different than another unique situation? That's the kasha on Reb Meir. We're trying to understand why Reb Meir says what he says, and we say from the same Mishnah in another point that he's waffling. So what's the true Reb Meir? Is it yes or is it no? Rabbi Yehuda is consistent. You got to call it out all the time. He says we're not giving anybody a break, but Reb Meir seems to give a break in one case, and that doesn't make sense to us.
But if the person that found it was already trampled, first of all, he wouldn't use it, and whoever owned it wouldn't use it. So why bother?
No. He'll use it. He'll take it and give it to his dogs at home. In other words, the question is, do you call out and say, "I found this bread. Did someone lose this bread?" Okay, so I mean, you could say, okay, why bother? But let's just say that he bothered, and he found the bread and he wanted to keep it for himself, even though it was trampled on and everything else. He wanted to keep it. The Gemara is just making us understand, regardless of that outcome, can you keep it or do you have to find? Remember, we have the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda. Okay, is it a mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda to return trampled bread to somebody else? Let's say for the moment, yes. It's still a mitzvah to return it to the right person for whatever reason, because bread is scarce and they want to have it for their animal, or whatever reason. It doesn't matter. So
Rabbi, one possible reason why you should announce it, whether it was trampled or not, was maybe somebody was bringing it as a gift, and he got to the place where he was supposed to deliver it. He didn't have it. If the thing is announced, he said, I found it, but it was destroyed. That at least the person who baked it would know that it had to bake another one or do something else or apologize to the recipient or something.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a valid thought. I mean, in other words, the reason is right now is not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on the question of whether there is an obligation of someone to perform the mitzvah of Shabbos Aveda, or is it beyond the scope of a Shabbos Aveda because it's no longer an item that can be returned, whatever state it's in. So in other words, Reb Meir says, you know what, forget about it. It's lost. Don't even bother. Rabbi Yehuda always takes the position, as does Rava, to be more machmir. But here, it seems like Reb Meir's waffling. In one case, he says, "Oh, there's a siman. Announce it." And another case, "Oh, there's a siman. Don't announce it." So you have to reconcile Reb Meir. At least find an underlying reason why Reb Meir is not consistent. That's what the Gemara is asking here. The Reb Meir is not consistent because of these people.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
The question is, what is the object that is lost that you're returning? In one case, might be a piece of cake. In the other case, it's the idea that the cake was destroyed. So the thing is changing is not the object, it's the idea behind the object. In other words, if somebody had wanted to give a gift and the thing was destroyed,
are you distinguishing between someone who bakes a beautiful bread and wants to give it as a gift, and that bread gets destroyed, as opposed to someone who also baked something but put something in it to surprise his guest? Let's say both of them were going to be gifts, and one of them, there's this minig to have what's called schlissel bread, where you put a key in for whatever the reason. Okay, so if someone, so let's say that's what it is, not a coin, make it more personal. It's a key, and people bake it that way, and they want to give it as a gift, and that bread got destroyed and trampled on, and it's no longer recognizable that was schlissel bread. So in the one circumstance, what's the chilek between baking that with an item in it, or baking a unique bread that only you bake because you do it different than everybody else?
Well, again, it's the same thing, because if the bread was intact and it was distinguishable because it was by some individual, yeah, you would announce that, because the bread is an object that can be returned. If the bread is trampled on, then the thing that has to be returned is the fact that the bread was found in this particular location and it was no longer usable. That gives information to whoever might have baked it or whoever lost it, that
Right. So you would think that Rabbi Meir would be consistent, and he would say, in both cases, if I'm makel, if I'm lenient, in both cases, I don't have to announce it. So why is Rabbi Meir saying in one case you announce, and one case you don't announce? So that's, I mean, you're really hitting on it. And the question is, Rabbi Yehuda is consistent and says you always have to announce. Rabbi Meir is the one who's being inconsistent. Why in one case you don't announce, and in the other case you do announce? That's what we're trying to understand. So let's just look at the answer, because the answer will help us understand Rabbi Meir's thinking. The question here, I mean, the uniqueness of a privately baked bread versus a bread that looks like everybody else's but has something in it is really besides the point. The question is, why does Rabbi Meir take a different tact in one case than the other, and why does he not always say, whenever you find a piece of bread that the public can step on, and it's likely that it won't look the same as when it started, why is that not yiyush? The owner gives up. In one case, he says, for sure the owner is going to give up. And in another case, he says, no, chayiv lahakras, you have to announce. That inherently is the question of why Reb Meir has two views. So let's look at the Gemara's answer. So the Gemara comes and says, now we have to think of it differently. Okay, so let's go weiter. Elo Omer Rav Zvid, Bishmei Derava. Just a little trick or a hint. Whenever the Gemara says Elo, it means that we're retracting and now we're giving a final answer. In other words, Omer Rav Zvid gave an answer. Very good. There's a kasha. So he comes back and says Elo Omer. So now that Elo means he's reconsidered, and now he's giving us his final thought. Elo Omer Rav Zvid Mishmei Derava. The Kula Alma Savre Simon Asa Libris have a Simon. Even Rab Meir agrees that Simon Asa Libris have a Simon. Up until now, we're saying lo have a Simon, just like Rabbo said lo have a Simon. Yeah, it is a Simon. Umarvir and ala Oakland, and people are kicking around food because it's not being picked up. So if that's the case, what's distinguishable between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda? V'hocha b'simen habo me'elav kol miflegei. We're talking about a siman that came by itself, a true siman that came by itself, meaning he didn't know that that piece of glass fell into the compound, or he didn't know that he had a quarter sitting on the ledge, and when he was kneading the dough and he was shaking, that quarter fell in and he didn't observe it. That's what we're talking about. Now, what is the machlokes? The Tanakama Sava Siman Habo Me'elav Lo Have a Siman. Rab Meir is taking the position that a siman that literally came by itself, you could never expect the owner to say, that's my bread, because there's no way he would know it. So Rab Meir is now literally taking the words of Siman Habo Me'elav and saying that's the machlokes. To me, says Rab Meir, you could never have a siman that comes by itself because the owner won't know to weigh in and say it's mine. Rabbi Yehuda Sava have a siman. And Rabbi Yehuda says it is a siman, that a siman haba me'elav, notwithstanding that he doesn't know it, you still have to announce it because somehow maybe it'll come to him that it's his. So, okay, so we had this discussion, I think Chaim, or whoever said before. So siman haba me'elav, okay, I am totally ignorant of the fact that my bread has a quarter in it. If you were to announce who lost the bread with a quarter, I wouldn't say a word because to me, that's not my bread. I didn't bake it with a quarter in it. That's Reb Meir. Reb Yehuda is saying, I baked a loaf of bread. I didn't put a quarter in it. Or at least I don't know that I put a quarter in it. So siman haba me'elav still is a siman that you don't walk away with it, you announce it. Now, maybe 99 times out of 100, no one will respond. But the Gemara is telling us that Rabbi Yehuda, who is machmir, as is Rava, will still say you have to announce it on the off chance that when you announce it, that person will be able to put 2 and 3 and 4 together and wind up with the right answer.
Off chance, I was counting coins on my kitchen counter, and I left a quarter right there. It was an old quarter with a.
I had $1 worth of change, and now I look and I have 75 cents worth of change. What happened to my quarter? I didn't put it in the bread, but wait a minute. Oh, there was coins sitting right on top of the shelf, right. And I remember we shook it,
right,
and then we went weiter. Is it so? I didn't put it in there. It's me'elav, but somehow if you announce it and say, "Did someone find that bread?" Like you just said, they'll put it all together and say.
But now it's not a siman you could ever prove if it's a mass-produced item, right?
That's right. You have to surmise it. But what's the question here? The question is, will a person be miyayesh? The underlying question is, will a person say, forget about it, I lost it, there's no way. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, still announce it.
Because he may not have been miyayesh.
You never know. Someone, even a blind man, might throw a dart and hit the target. You never know. So
he may not have been miyayesh when he saw he was missing 25 cents.
That's correct.
What may he have thought? There's some way this quarter will turn up somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Rabbi Yehuda takes the position that a person will not totally give up even to the 0.5%, to a 0.5%. Therefore, he's machmir. So that's what the Gemara is telling us, that's the machlokes. The machlokes is truly in a case where it fell in by itself. Not that we extrapolate that he put it there, which Rashi earlier said. So if you take the view that it happened by itself, then that's the machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda. Now, what about Rabbah? Let's just go weiter. V'Rabbah Amalach. This is Rava. V'Rabbah Amalach. The Kula Alman Simon also this loy have a simon. Remember, we're learning this in Rava, who is it says Amar Reb Zvid B'Shmei de Rava in the name of Rava. Right. Rava is machmir, right? Rava was the machmir. Therefore, he's trying to find a way to be machmir. What about Rabbah? Rabbah is the one who's makel. V'Rabbah Amalach. The Kula Alman Simon also this loy have a simon. Everybody, in other words, in his view, everybody agrees that a siman that can be trampled on cannot be counted as a siman. And people do not leave food on the ground. In other words, people are respectful of food, which is what we said last week was his position, that people don't just leave food hefker. I know myself, when I see a piece of food on the ground, I'll take a piece of paper, pick up, even if it's squashed, and throw it away, because that's the way we were taught. We were taught that food is something from the Rabbeinu Shalom, and you should just not. It's a bizoyin. We call it a bizoyin. It's not. It doesn't pass for the food. Not for me. I'm not going to eat a squashed banana, but you should take the food, not just leave it there.
Rabbi, there was another case. I think there was discussed either earlier or somewhere else about fruit that's scattered. Somebody drops like from a wagon with fruit, right, and it's scattered with a long distance between it, he's not
Right.
likely to go back and pick it up. So you can keep it, but if there's a bunch of it in one place, it's not.
Then it looks like it was, it
Come
looks
back
like
and
it was,
pick it up.
yeah, because it was intentionally put there and someone meant to come back. That's exactly right. But food that falls off a wagon, no one is gonna, first of all, he may not even know. I mean, how many times have we driven on the highway and you see things falling off a truck, a fruit truck? It could be who knows what. That person who's driving doesn't even know it fell off. I mean, there's clearly not going to be any intent to try to collect it because he'll long since have passed the point. But from our point here, Rabbah is interpreting and saying that everybody says it's not a siman because it can be stepped on, and people don't leave food lying around. And we're talking about siman habo me'elav, just like Rabbah said. Tanakam Masava lo have a siman, Rabbi Yudasava have a siman. So in other words, Rabbah reconciles his view as to why he is Makam. So what do we learn from this whole Gemara? I mean, it's a very short piece we learned today, but this Gemara is giving us, is opening our minds to understanding how you look at different ways of looking at this little piece of Gemara. You have a machlokes between Maroim on the one hand and Tanoim on the other hand. The machlokes seems to be parallel, Rabbah to Rav Meir, Rabbah to Rav Yehuda, and the Gemara is trying to understand what's the basis of the machlokes. So the Gemara goes through and tells us the basis of the machlokes, and then we see, okay, so is that the machlokes of Rabbah and Rabbah? The Gemara is telling us it's not exactly the machlokes of Rabbah and Rabbah. We thought that it was totally on all fours. Rav Meir is like Rabbah, Rav Yehuda is like Rabbah. We can all go home fine. No. When Rabbah learned the machlokes, Rabbah was a great Amira. He knew that there was a machlokes between Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda, and so did Rabbah. Except that the ground rules for the machlokes were slightly different. In Rava's ground rules, he says everybody admits that siman also libris lo have a siman. If you have a siman and it's going to be stepped on, not a siman. And we're talking about food that isn't picked up, so it's going to be stepped on. So Rava is already giving you the ground rules that food lying in the street lies on the street, and everybody agrees that if you step on it, it's going to be not a siman. So it's easy for Rava to say, you know what? So in that particular case, there's a machlokes between the Tanoim as to whether or not that's considered to be a siman or not. Rabbah,
I think, Rabbi, but
But you were talking about Amoraim, weren't you? I mean, Rava and Rabbah are Amoraim.
right, and they're setting the ground rules for their machlokes, and their ground rules for their machlokes are different. Rava's ground rules are not Rabbah's ground rules. Rabbah will come and say that would say siman also libridis loy have a siman. Rabbah, I'm sorry, did I confuse him? Rabbah is the one who's going to say loy have a siman, and people pick it up. So if people pick it up and still loy have a siman, therefore that's the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Rava, on the other hand, says that people will not pick it up, and siman also just have a siman. So, in other words, they're just changing the ground rules as to what the machlokes between Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is. At the end, Rav Meir and Rabbi Yehuda have a machlokes, and Rava and Rabbah are disputing what are the ground rules of that machlokes. So remember, what's the underlying question? Why didn't Rava and Rabbah say in the Beis Medrash to the Talmidim, we're having a machlokes, but you know what? These Tanoim had the same machlokes. The Gemara is telling us why they didn't say it, because it isn't on all fours. Rabbah has a different interpretation, therefore he views the machlokes differently, so he can't say that his machlokes is my machlokes, and Rabbah has a different ground rule. So because each one has a different ground rule, that's the reason why they didn't announce at the beginning of their shiur. The Rosh Yeshiva gives a shiur, and he's going to give a shiur, and someone's going to be listening to the shiur and they'll say, you know what, Rebbe, you're telling me something that sounds strangely like something I already read in the Mishnah. What are you being mechadish here? So Rava has to explain to his Talmidim what he's being mechadish, and Rava has to explain to his Talmidim what he's being mechadish. That's what the Gemara. That's the whole exchange in this Gemara. Is that it isn't on all fours for everybody, and everybody is happy. That there is within the machlokes, there's a machlokes. Within the discussion, there is a differing view, Rava's view and Rabba's view. That's the ultimate that would come out of this. Ahead,
Rabbi, the basis of any machlokes on this issue is the Torah commandment to return lost articles is very strong.
Right.
And repeated. I think we're going to come to it in a couple of weeks again.
Right.
And there's very little leeway or wiggle room in the Torah explicitly for exemptions. But the Chachamim of this, both of the time of the Tanoim and the Amoraim, knew it was impractical for every lost article to be forever in limbo.
Right.
They had to be, and the talking about the ground rules would change with different circumstances, just as today the ground rules would have to take into consideration long-range transit of trucks going thousands of miles, whereas in the old days, something that dropped off something was
all local.
Local. So these things change, but it's all because the Chacham had to come up with practical ground rules for when you don't have to return it, because the Torah is very explicit. Return it.
Right, exactly. So in order for someone to say don't return it, which sounds like it's going against the Torah, right? Because the Torah says return it, he has to explain why you don't return it. Everything should be returned. Everything should be returned to everybody. But there are times when you can't return it because it's trampled on and people don't regard food and therefore leave it on the ground. So therefore, but again, you come from the view of, you know what, it's like lahavdil. I mean, we say this even in our times. We say that it's a machlokes of poskim. One poskim is machmer, one poskim is mekel. It's the same question. Why is one mekel and one is machmer? Is because one looked at it from that standpoint, as Rabbi Moshe, let's say, says that I'm more mekel because not that the halacha, I'm chas v'sholom violating the halacha, but I'm mekel because I see it in a way that allows me to say this is okay. Whereas another Paisik in the same circumstance would view it differently, as does Abai and as does Rabba and Rava. So you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. But it's fascinating to take a piece of Gemara like this and to just knead it and go through it and see that on something that seems fairly straightforward, there are nuances because each one held a different view on what people do. Do people pick up food or don't they pick up food? Well, are people's minds attuned to the fact that this is mine no matter what, and I'm never going to be miyayish? Or does a person say, fait accompli, I have to be practical. I lost this object, and we're gonna see at the end of this Gemara, I don't want to say it yet, is that all the Gemara comes down to one line of how a person thinks. So if you want to look ahead, you'll see it, but that's the maskana of the Gemara. That at the end of the day, does a person throw up his hands and say, I give up, or not? And that's kind of, at the end of the day, you're going to say, is that it? And the answer is yes. You may feel I lost something, but I'm tenacious. I'm not giving up. There's a fraction of 1% chance. I'm going with it. And someone else say, "Fa'fallen, I'll live another day, so I won't have that particular quarter." Again, like Chaim said, maybe it was an unusual quarter. It was an old quarter, something that had value to it, and he doesn't want to just be miyayish. So again, this is the give and take. So okay, so Mitchell will pick up. There's a lot more on this, but we really focused on this today to understand the underlying machlokes. Now, the Gemara, the next Gemara is an Ikeda Amre is another view on the same thing, which we'll get to next week. But basically, I think we now have an understanding as to Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda and Rabba and Rava. So I think we can move a little bit more quickly next week. But it was a wonderful discussion just to understand the underlying thinking of the Gedolim. Dr. Kaya, excellent, very nice.
Good. Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a wonderful week. Sei gesund.
Thank you.